The Democratic Alliance has written to the International Monetary Fund to report a possible breach by the government of the terms of the $4.3 billion loan that it granted to South Africa. The party says Treasury's decision to spend 10 billion rand on bailing out the insolvent South African Airways is a misuse of that loan. The bailout is expected to be funded by budgetary cuts to other government departments and programs. However, the DA says the loan provided to the country is subject to full transparency and accountability and has asked the IMF to request an account of how the loan has been spent. For more on this, let's bring in the DA's MP, Gordon Hill-Lewis, who joins us from Cape Town via our video link this morning. Gordon, thanks very much for your time. Welcome to the AM report. The DA, and in fact you, have spoken out quite broadly over the past few months about how we should be responding to SAA's financial woes. But let's clarify what you're actually asking for now. You're essentially requesting the IMF to watch government that it might spend this money on the SAA bailout, but we're not sure if this is in fact government's plan to begin with.
We are reasonably sure. Good morning, it's lovely to be with you. We're reasonably sure because credible reports suggest that the Treasury has proposed two cuts, one from a public employment program that was promised as part of the COVID relief package, and cuts to the budget for PRASA, for rail infrastructure. Now, this is obviously two programs that are incredibly important and much needed in South Africa, given the level of unemployment and real suffering that's going on at the moment as a result of the COVID lockdown. So to cut those kind of programs to prioritize SAA is, we are arguing, is wrong.
Okay. How does the IMF then get involved? And perhaps I should prelude by mentioning, we all know that when you get a loan from the IMF, you need to have a letter of intent, which is essentially you outlining how you're planning to spend this money. Part of what Treasury said in that letter of intent is that the money will be used to solve the balance of payments, problems caused by the pandemic, but also will be used to support economic reform. In my mind, they could be clutching at straws, but I can hear an argument being made about how maintaining a viable SAA could eventually see to the sustenance of some kind of economic reform.
Look, I have no doubt that the government will try to make that kind of argument, try to split hairs about the exact wording of the letter. But the fact is, we are actually making we are making two arguments. We're making a technical argument and we're making a moral argument. The technical argument is that this loan was primarily for COVID relief, and the money should be used for healthcare expenses and for supporting families and businesses through this extremely difficult time. And again, to prioritize SAA over those things is morally wrong, and that's the moral element. There are just far more important things to spend that money on in South Africa at the moment. The second point is that the government did commit to a program of economic reform, and has often said that that program includes what they call rationalizing SOEs, or finding private buyers for some of the state-owned entities. So it seems to me that it's also not consistent with what they have said over the last few years, and indeed this year, about SAA itself. So for all of those reasons, it would be totally wrong to prioritize SAA over essentially direct support for really struggling families in South Africa right now.
And what happens if the IMF asks for reasons why it should even look into this outside of what you're calling credible reports, that the government is in fact planning to use this money in this way? In other words, why should we even, I guess, believe that this is in fact government's plans outside of just reports that it is?
Well, look, we've got a medium-term budget coming up on the 21st of October, when we will know the answer to that question definitively. The finance minister will come to Parliament and table his medium-term budget, and it's expected that he will announce this further bailout for SAA and show where it will come from. And I'm prepared to wager that it will come from direct cuts to other government programs and services to the poor, and that is unacceptable. So what we are saying is we are raising this concern to the IMF in advance of that budget, and before that they can ask the government these questions directly and insist on the transparency and accountability that the government did commit to in its letter of intent, as you have mentioned. And that's a perfectly reasonable question for them to ask, since that is the agreement that they have with the government.
I imagine, of course, as you were thinking through this plan, you were also thinking of what the IMF can actually do. What are the possible scenarios that could play out after that? Can the IMF ask for the money back?
No, they can't. As you will recall, the money is actually unconditional. There are no formal conditions. There are only the things that the government committed to in its letter. And that's why we're saying the IMF should at least make use of those commitments in the letter to try and put some additional pressure on the government to make the argument that this bailout is wrong. Of course, if the ANC wants to press ahead with this bailout, regardless of the moral arguments and regardless of what South Africa and the international community says, unfortunately it's able to do that. But then it must deal with the consequences of the additional suffering and unemployment and poverty in the country. What we are trying to do up until that point is place as much pressure on them as possible to make the moral argument that this is the wrong decision. It should not go ahead with this bailout, and it should prioritize the needs of South African families right now, and small businesses in particular, over the needs of a bankrupt airline.
The difficulty, of course, Gordon, is the fact that government has already committed to, I guess, finding this money in some way. I think the wording was something along the lines of reprioritizing the budget. If that does eventually go ahead, as per that commitment, where does the DA suggest the money should at least come from? I know the grander argument being made by the organizations that SAA shouldn't be bailed out, but in the event that we do have to deal with that inevitability, has the organization, the opposition party at least, given some thought to where the money should be coming from at least?
Well, our point of departure is that it should not happen.
Yeah.
There's no doubt in our minds that it will have to come from deep cuts to basic services, education, healthcare, policing services. And, if you look at what the pressure that those basic services are already under in our country, teachers are teaching classes of 45 children and up. Nurses are working to the bone. Doctors are working 36-hour shifts. Policemen don't have the basic equipment they need to fight crime. So, those basic services desperately require more resources, not less, and yet we are here talking about 10.5 billion rand in cuts from those basic resources. So, our point of departure simply is that it should not happen. And if it must happen, then, it's up to the ANC to justify and defend why we should cut those basic services at a time like this when they are desperately needed to prioritize this bankrupt airline.
Okay, so there is at least room for entertaining the fact that, if the money has to come from somewhere, just a strong argument needs to be made about where that place should be. Well, again, I would never support those cuts, never ever, certainly not in a time like this. But it's for the ANC to make that argument and justify that decision, as long as the country knows and everyone is clear about the choice. Because when hospitals have to shut down, or clinics have to shut down, or nurses have to get laid off to pay for this, then we must be absolutely clear that that was a deliberate choice, and they must face the consequences for that. All right. Thanks very much for coming on to the AM Report and weighing in on this issue. Once again, the DA has certainly made its own views known about SAA for quite some time, and I guess we'll see how this particular development pans out. Gordon Hill Lewis is a DA MP weighing in on that issue. Thanks very much indeed.